Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to those on the East Coast where we are now. My name is Kim Leary, and I have the honor of being the Urban Institute's Senior Vice President. For those of you who don't yet know me, I joined Urban just this past July 1, from Harvard University, where I am a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School and an associate professor at Harvard's Medical School and School of Public Health. I'm thrilled to be at Urban now and delighted to moderate this afternoon's event on protecting student loan borrowers. Today's event is part of a series of discussions that the Urban Institute is holding with leading changemakers and Urban's own research analysts on questions emerging from the COVID-19 crisis and the long overdue reckoning with ongoing structural racism within our nation. I'm pleased to be joined today by three very distinguished guests whom I'll introduce shortly. We only have 45 minutes, which is a short amount of time and lots of cover, so I'll be brief. But let me first begin with a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and the recording and all relevant links will be posted online after today's event. You'll notice that all participants are muted, but we do invite your participation, and we ask you to type your questions and comments into the question box at any time. We hope to get to as many questions as we can in the short time we have available. But even if we don't have a chance to answer your question live online, it's extremely helpful for us and for the panelists to know what you're thinking about, as your questions will also help us to shape what we do here in the future. Let me begin with by also letting you know that today's conversation can also be joined on Twitter. And if you do, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Let me begin with just a few orienting remarks before I go ahead and introduce our guests. Today, we're going to talk about how to protect student loan borrowers whose challenges have been exacerbated by the pandemic. The CARES Act uneven suspension of all federal loan payments and interest reaches its end in September, even though the economy continues to struggle. And we should note that not all student loans are relieved. And as with many issues we face, particularly at this moment, the cost, in this case, of debt is not borne equally. In fact, before the pandemic, many borrowers with the largest loan balances had high incomes to show for it, while those with small loans and lower education levels faced a high risk of default. Black student borrowers in particular face tremendously high rates of student loan default and are among the people most likely to have lost jobs because of the pandemic. So in today's conversation, we'll explore the effects of the pandemic on student loan borrowers. We'll explain the risk to borrowers if they pause on debt repayment, if the pause on debt repayment expires. And we'll explore how those risks are affected by race, systemic racism, and socioeconomic status. And finally, we'll seek to identify evidence-based policy options for protecting borrowers amid the pandemic. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests and invite them into conversation. First, I'm pleased to welcome Fenaba Addo, who is the Lorna Jorgensen Wendt Professor of Money, Relationships, and Equality in the School of Human Ecology's Department of Consumer Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. James Kvaal is the president of the Institute for College Access and Success. He also served as a domestic policy advisor in the Obama White House, where I'm pleased to say I had the opportunity to work with him occasionally when I was at the White House Council on Women and Girls. And I'm also delighted to introduce Sandy Baum, who is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and my colleague. So we've organized today into three main areas or buckets, though I think we'll range quite broadly. Let me begin first by posing some questions to our panelists about the current policy and risks to borrowers. So James, if I may, let me begin with a question to you. What did Congress have in mind when it provided for repayment relief in the CARES Act? And can you quickly recap for us how it structured the relief and why it took that approach?
Thanks, Kim. I'm delighted to be here today to be a part of this conversation. In March, Congress suspended payments and interest on most federal student loans through September 30. So that is a little bit longer than a 6-month period. And that means no payments were due. They could be made voluntarily. There were no involuntary collections like wage garnishments, and no interest accrues in the meantime. Now, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, the pause applies to most federal loans, but it doesn't apply to federally guaranteed loans that are owned by banks, to Perkins loans that are made by colleges with federal funds, and it doesn't apply to wholly private student loans, which are student loans made with no federal involvement. The action of putting a complete pause in place on student loans is unprecedented, and of course, the economic situation we're in is unprecedented. Our economy contracted by 1/3 this spring. 30 million people apply for unemployment, and with numbers like that, there's not a lot of danger of overreacting to the moment we're in. Also unprecedented is the fact that this is the first recession in the student debt economy, and total debt has tripled to $1.5 trillion since the Great Recession began in 2008. So when Congress enacted this student loan pause, it had two goals. One was to help those borrowers who are struggling to make payments. In effect, it offers an interest-free loan to 18 million borrowers in repayment, worth about $5,000 on average. Secondly, Congress delivers an economic stimulus, so that's a total of $45 billion or up to $45 billion being put into the economy over the 6 months that could help sustain consumer spending. And it's done in a very low-cost way, given that those loans will eventually be repaid and interest rates are at very low levels. So the question now is, when payments resume on October 1, what will happen, and will Congress do something to further extend the pause on payments and interest?
Sandy, maybe you can pick up on that point there. What are the risks to borrowers if the pause expires with no other solutions in place?
Well, like many other people in the economy, many student loan borrowers remain unemployed, are becoming unemployed, are struggling with a variety of pressures. So if Congress does nothing, it will cause severe problems for a significant number of people, and I think we all hope they will do something. It's unfortunate that here we are 6 months later, just thinking again about, oops, what can we do at the last minute quickly? Because obviously it's not just people with student debt who are struggling. I mean, if you had to choose, should I pay my rent? Should I skip my rent and get evicted? Should I skip my student loan? I mean, student loans are real hardship for many people, but so are a lot of other things. So our hope is that Congress will do something for student loan borrowers as a piece of a much bigger rescue package, and that also we can start thinking about the right long-term solutions, so that, I mean, there are a lot of people really struggling, but there are also a lot of people, like most of us, working at home and maintaining our incomes and as able to make payments as we were before. So given our limited resources, it would be great if we could figure out how to target them.
So Sandy, you really underscore that there are clearly a number of competing needs across the country right now, and that many people are vulnerable in a multitude of ways. Fenaba, should we be particularly concerned about student loan borrowers?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So I think we should be concerned about student loan borrowers insofar as we should be concerned about every American that has been negatively impacted by the pandemic and the economic crisis, right? So I know we're going to talk a little bit more later on policies, but I think by enacting and maintaining policies that provide broad-based relief to everyone, we can also help student loan borrowers.
Mm-hmm. So James and Sandy, do you agree?
I do. I would just add that oftentimes there are young people struggle in the economy particularly, and we know from the experience in the Great Recession college graduates, others leaving college, often had higher unemployment rates and their earnings were depressed, not just coming out of college, but often for years afterwards. So there's likely to be some real hardship out there. Sorry, Sandy, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you didn't cut me off. But I agree with both of you. I mean, it's really clear that, first of all, recent college graduates or people who left college recently are going to pay for this for a long time in many ways. That's true of those who are leaving college, whether they have student loans or not. And we just need to, what you said in the introduction, Kim, about that some of the people with the largest debts are people who actually have pretty high incomes. We need to remember that as we think about it. Many people with very small debts are struggling the most, as are many people who never went to college.
So you're taking us right into this area of inequitable risk burdens. And we also want to try to take up the structural causes. So it's clear that the effects of student debt burden are not equally distributed. Sandy, can you tell us even a little more about who's hit hardest by the student debt and how it's impacting them?
Well, so as I just said, measuring student debt burden and measuring student debt obligations, those are two different things. So the people with the largest burdens, meaning the biggest struggle to repay loans, tend to be people who left college without a credential and therefore don't have college level earnings to show for it and to support their debt payments. Also, we know, as you mentioned also in the introduction, that Black students tend to borrow more than other students who are pursuing the same kinds of educational goals and then struggle more to repay. Frequently, students who went to for-profit institutions have higher debt levels than other people who have similar credentials. So these are groups of people who are particularly vulnerable. But again, and then who has the highest levels of debt? People went to graduate school. I mean, the federal government is only lending a relatively small amount of money to undergraduate students. And they lend infinite amounts of money to graduate students. So if you're talking about $100,000 of debt, that's somebody who went to graduate school if they have that much federal debt. So we have to think about that in terms of how we conceptualize what it means to be burdened by student debt.
Fenaba and James, I wonder if we can drill down a little bit more, and could you tell us what you see about the inequities being and how they're exacerbated by the pandemic and now the associated economic crisis? You've alluded to it, this is a very distinct time. How is it affecting this particular challenge?
Yes, so I guess I'll start. One of the things I would like to underscore is that student loan borrowers, and more specifically the vulnerable populations that Sandy just highlighted, Black borrowers in particular, are more than their debt, right? So when we think about, even if we look at the stats by Black college graduates, they have greater outstanding loan balances and are struggle with default and delinquency. So it's not just non-completers, but also, independent of educational attainment, we see that these inequalities persist. One of the things I would also like to say that we saw that this pandemic, started in early to mid-March, has continued almost now for about 6 months. But, to be real, wage, unemployment, wealth inequality persists and existed long before the pandemic started, right? And so there were people within our society, in particular in these groups, who were not faring as well as many other people have been faring, even during the economic boom that followed the Great Recession. These are populations that have experienced low wages, precarious work schedules, high rates of unemployment, job insecurity, food and housing insecurity, may not have wealth or even enough emergency, or we have enough emergency savings or maybe depleting their emergency savings during this period. And so there are pre-existing inequalities that were in existence prior to the pandemic. And because of the pandemic, the economic slowdown, the economy shut down and now slow down, we see these inequalities being exacerbated. So if we can't talk about the current, how the pandemic is affecting populations, if we don't talk about the inequalities that existed prior to the pandemic, I think.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
I
I
should.
think another
Sorry.
group. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I was going to give an example
Please go
yeah.
ahead. Yeah, go
Okay, so I
ahead.
was going to say that we know in particular that women and Black women have some of the highest loan balances and carry a disproportionate share of the student loan debt. We also know women are more likely to be, caregivers and teachers, small business owners, and self-employed. And so we know that these are the particular occupations and industries that were hit in particular during this period. And so we see this intersection of both student loan borrowers, concentrations of who's holding student loan debt, as well as particular industries and occupations that they were overrepresented in being especially impacted by the pandemic. So I just wanted to provide that as an example.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would like to add some level of concern for current and future students as well. And if you look at state budgets, Center on Budget Policy Priorities projects a 20% revenue shortfall. Historically, colleges and universities have taken more than their share. That's on top of additional costs of public health and moving to online. 3/4 of students go to public colleges and universities. And if you look at what happened in the Great Recession, you saw per student funding fall by $2,000. First student borrowing rose by $1,100 a year. And, that state funding never fully came back before the new recession hit. So, there really is potential for debt levels to spike even higher. And for more and more people to be taking out loans that they're going to struggle to be able to repay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what's really at stake, James, and to all of you, actually, if we fail to help borrowers now?
Well, I'm concerned about, in my opinion, our system of higher education is one of the most important institutions we have for promoting equal opportunity and upward mobility. And we know that intuitively. More and more we know from the research just how powerful the effect of a college education can be. And yet we are shifting the burdens of financing it more and more on the backs of students. And the system is just not reliable enough for that. We have a nationwide graduation rate of about 60%. Some students who graduate aren't able to find jobs or continue to enroll in further education. And so the system is getting riskier and riskier. And, we badly need college to be the reliable route to opportunity and to closing disparities that it has potential to be.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts from the panelists about what's at stake if we fail to help borrowers? Yes, Sandy.
I would add to that that's all true. And we certainly need college education to be an important and accessible and affordable opportunity for everyone who can benefit from it. But we also have to recognize that we do have in place already, predating the crisis, policies to protect student loan borrowers that are unlike policies to protect anybody else. So we have income-driven repayment programs. About a third of borrowers now and about half of the outstanding debt are in programs where you don't have to make any payments if your income is less than 150% of the poverty line. And then if it's higher than that, you just pay an affordable share of your income. So already, if that system worked really well, if it were automatic, we need to improve it. It's not automatic. Many people are not in it. But if that system had been really reliably in place, then we wouldn't have to be worrying about this pause, because when you lost your job, you wouldn't have to make payments. We don't do that for utility bills and medical bills and other kinds of debts. And plus, going to college, I just want to reiterate the importance of what James is saying. Going to college is the pathway for many, many people to upward mobility, to a high standard of living. It doesn't work for everyone, and we need to protect people. But unlike other kinds of borrowing that people do, this is a kind of borrowing that has high potential to help you in the future.
Hi. So yeah, I agree with my fellow panelists on a lot of the points that they made. I guess I would just add that thinking a little bit more short term about, I think Sandy alluded to this already, we don't want to put people in positions where they have to juggle or decide which debts or which bills they need to pay. And so if we're particularly interested or focused on or concerned about the most vulnerable student loan borrowers, then by not creating policies that will be able to support them through this crisis may also lead to other types of insecurities in food or housing and so forth. And we also know from work, as I was also alluded to, that these potential like dings to one's credit report, could have long-term consequences across the life course, making borrowing more expensive or harder to acquire assets such as home ownership and so forth. So there are both very short-term and long-term consequences of not dealing with debt or increasing the risk associated with default and delinquency.
You know, you've all made that point so clear that there's an immediate consequence, but because many people, not all, but many people who are in college or in a particular age group, we're also thinking about an important milestone in their lives that the impact reverberates throughout the life course. So I think we're all now interested, we have a good sense of what the challenges are. You know, what are the options now? What can we do? What are the policy options that you'd advocate for? And Sandy, you've already started talking with us about the forgiveness programs. And some have called more recently for the government to forgive 10,000 or more of every borrower's student debt. And you've let us know that such a policy is likely to benefit the wealthiest borrowers. So what would a more equitable policy look like instead?
Well, first of all, I mean, the problem that we're talking about is that a lot of people just don't have enough money, right? I mean, really, the problem is that there are people who didn't have enough money before the crisis, and then certainly now don't have enough money for any of the things that they need, including paying their student loans. So one thing that we can do is make sure that we replace lost earnings for people who have lost their earnings. And that would be like, if they have that money, then they can actually make choices about which things to spend it on. But particularly with respect to student debt, making sure, again, that our income-driven repayment programs really work well and are there for everyone when they need them, and they don't face bureaucratic problems. And when you lose your job, you don't have to present lots of paperwork and prove it, that it happens automatically. That system in place is the best protection, but that's not going to happen tomorrow. I mean, I would not suggest that let's just say, well, let's do that, and then we don't have to worry about anything else now, because that is something that's going to take a while. Let's start now and get it into place. Meanwhile, we have to do something right now to make sure that the people who don't have that protection are protected. And certainly extending the pause is a reasonable thing to do until we can get a better system in place. We can talk about whether it makes sense to forgive everybody's interest payments, because if you owe $5,000, that's a few dollars a month. And if you owe $200,000, that's a really big gift to you. So that's an issue. And in terms of forgiveness, like these programs have forgiveness at the end of them if you have a long-term problem. And the problem is that, you know, I mean, there are people who have low incomes for a long period of time. If you've been in an income support program for a few years, you're not going to be able to repay your loan. And there's no reason to make you wait 20 years to get that debt forgiven. But there are other people who have some amount of debt and they're going to be fine in a few years, or they're fine now and they could make their payments now. So that should be something that we target more carefully. We need to do something now. What we do now and what we can implement quickly is different from the best long-term policy.
Fenaba and James, what about the policy tools that you would prioritize to protect vulnerable borrowers as the crisis continues, as it seems to show every evidence of doing?
Yeah, so I agree with Sandy. I think because of the intersecting groups or populations that are experiencing the pandemic and have we're focused on the vulnerable student loan borrowers. I think we really need to prioritize getting income into the hands of these populations. And so extending unemployment insurance would be at the top of my list. Extending the suspension period that is set to expire at the end of September, and extending the type of loans, which James alluded to earlier, to include private student loan debt as well, as a part of thinking about this. I agree also with Sandy with regard to income-driven repayment systems. That is a system that needs to be fixed or corrected in order to better serve. Right now it's an opt-in program, an opt-in program, and thinking about maybe recalibrating it to be an opt-out program as well is something that we could, one of the potential mechanisms to help borrowers during this time. So I'll just stop there.
Not much disagreement here. I think we should extend the pause on payments and interest for the duration of the emergency. It should be expanded to cover all federal loans. And we need to think carefully about that payment restart, because what we've seen in the past after natural disasters is sometimes when those payments kick back in, students become delinquent or default. It's hard to get them back on the path of repayment. I think emergency aid to colleges and universities to help with coronavirus costs, to help with the state fiscal crisis, is a really essential element right now. Going forward, really agree on the centrality of income-driven repayment. We do need to make it simpler. We need to make it work better. And that's really true for the set of targeted loan forgiveness programs that the federal government offers. So if you look at, for example, the Borrower Defense Program for students who were cheated by their colleges, loans connected to illegal conduct, there are currently 125,000 of those borrowers sitting at the Education Department. Many of them have been waiting for 4 or 5 years for their cases to be held. And other types of eligible loan forgiveness we know people are eligible for. For example, we know people are eligible for disability discharges because by definition they're receiving Social Security disability benefits that makes them eligible, and yet 3/4 of them don't get it. We know students are eligible for closed school discharge because we know that they were attending. Half of them don't get it. Even the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program has got a lot of attention. 99% of applicants were rejected. So we need to do a lot to make sure that these programs are actually feasible for borrowers to navigate, that they know about them, that we use the information the government already collects to establish eligibility whenever possible. This whole student loan safety net needs to be much, much stronger.
Fenaba, let me ask you a question. You've helped us to appreciate that the challenges for student borrowers, particularly borrowers of color, that they start with inequities that preceded their seeking a loan to go to college. So the question I have for you is there a way for policy remedies now that protect student borrowers? Could they also be configured in some way to help promote wealth building and greater wealth equity? Or should the focus right now really be about just making sure things don't get worse for families who are already on the edge of financial insecurity?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question, and I think it falls squarely within the work that I have done with my colleague Jason Houle on trying to understand the relationship between racial wealth inequality in particular and student debt disparities, Black-white student debt disparities. So how can we help the most vulnerable people by improving their wealth position and not exacerbating wealth inequality? So from the work, some of the analysis that we have done, we found that in particular for young adults, so older millennials, student debt disparities constituted around 10% of the racial wealth gap. So we see that while it is contributing to some of the racial wealth gap, eliminating those disparities would not necessarily create widespread, wealth equity within our society. There are a lot of other contributing factors that are contributing to ongoing and persistent wealth inequality within our society. So that does not mean that we therefore don't target or try to fix the disparities within our society, but we also know that that's only going to be a piecemeal solution to broader societal wealth inequalities. So I think, in an effort to, it's always a question of the absolute versus the relative. Are we going to help move the distribution of everybody up by improving, by improving the wealth positions of those at the bottom, and potentially also improving the wealth positions of those who are doing okay or at the higher end of the wealth distribution? Or do we really want to have equitable policy solutions that can actually decrease the distribution or close, reduce the variance between the wealth distribution? And in this moment, I say, we could probably do both, right? We need to focus on how do we help those vulnerable borrowers? Well, we need to decrease or reduce the debt burden, which, at a very simple wealth equation, it's total value of one's assets minus the total value of one's debt. So we just reduce that debt burden. We could improve their wealth position by doing so, and helping those borrowers. And then think about how we could also implement more equitable solutions down the road. It doesn't have to be something that happens in the short term, but in the long term, to improve overall wealth equity within our society, not just necessarily just focused on student loan debt disparities, but other mechanisms as well.
Could I add to that? Because I think this point that Fenaba was making about putting student loan problems into a larger context is terrifically important, and we neglect it too often. Like, we tend to talk a lot about student debt, and we care about student debt and the problems that it's causing. But thinking of this as the primary problem, or that you can solve it on its own or solve the problems of the people who hold it on their own, is just a misconception. And this is one of, when you asked about what about, say, forgiving $10,000 of student debt, it might be a really good idea to give everybody $10,000. I mean, and not worry about whether some people don't need it, but so many people need $10,000 now. But if you said, how about if we give everybody $10,000, except, let's say if you never went to college, you can't have it. We're only going to give it to people who went to college. That would be outrageous, right? Because many of the people struggling the most never went to college. And if you say, let's just focus on forgiving $10,000 of student debt without saying what you're going to do for those people who never went to college because they couldn't afford it, that's a real problem. And somehow we have to see that larger context.
James, do you want to get in on this?
I agree. It's a challenge. I think that we do need to take a new look at programs like income-driven repayment. There's, we have to recognize that part of borrowers' economic situation is their wealth. And if you are targeting student loan relief based solely on income, you're not seeing the whole picture, and what you're missing is racially disparate. So we do need to look at that. Now, programs like Kvaal, Kvaal I believe about 60% of Black students benefit from Kvaal. Investments in Kvaal also have a compounding benefit in that they encourage more students to go to college, more students to graduate from college, and so that creates long-term leverage as well. So I do think it is really important to be looking at all of these issues through a racial lens, as well as looking at economic disparities, and that's something that we need to do better at.
We're at a place in the program where I think we could pause to see what questions have come from the participants. And I think 2 have come in so far. So if you have other questions, please make sure to add them to the Q&A. And if you'd like them to be directed to a particular panelist, that's great. Otherwise, we'll just put them to the group and have a robust conversation. So here's the first one. Is a targeted approach aiming relief at borrowers in distress possible and able to be implemented? That's the first question that's come up today. And that's to anyone.
So I think James should answer that, but I would say I think there are more targeted approaches, but I don't think we're going to implement one next month. I mean, you could come up with something that sounds like it'd be great and equitable, but to think that we're going to do that and do it effectively, because you have to know what people's current financial circumstances are, and that's something that's very difficult. So I don't think that's unfortunately going to be the short-term solution, but given that this looks like a long-term crisis, let's think now about how 6 months from now we could implement something like that.
I agree with Sandy. It's hard to do new thinking in a crisis like this, and you tend to do something that's well established and there's consensus around, or not at all. I do think that we're in the middle of a real debate here about who should pay for college and what's fair going forward, what's fair to people who took out loans in the past and are unable to repay them. We shouldn't short circuit that. I think there's some rounds to go in hearing different perspectives and understanding that. One example is, there are a lot of people out there who either didn't complete or they went to a low quality program and they're earning under the poverty line or maybe $15,000. They might have $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 in debt. If they were defrauded, that's one thing, but otherwise our answer to them is enroll in income-driven repayment. Make sure you jump through your hoops every year, and 20 years from now, whatever's left over will forgive every promise. Meantime, it's on your credit report. That's not a very satisfying answer when we know that there are, low-income single mothers who attempted to go to community college at night on the part-time 7-year plan and didn't make it through. Those people, I think, have a very compelling case for some additional relief.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question that's come through, also on income-driven repayment plans. And the question here is it a problem that income-driven repayment plans typically prioritize repayment on interest rather than principal? And will there be an effort to improve on these alternative ways to pay to stop the interest accumulation with those programs? Again, directed to the whole panel.
I'll take a crack. It is a problem. You see, interest accrue. Oftentimes earnings are low right out of college. And, large numbers of people in income-driven repayment are in negative amortization. Their interest is accruing faster than they're paying down. Now, if they stay in income-driven repayment, in a sense, if they're going to get their loans forgiven at the end of 20 years, if their incomes don't go up, their interest continues to go up faster than their payments, they're going to get that amount forgiven anyway. So for some of those students, it is a paper charge. But we've also found in working with students, they find it tremendously demoralizing and confusing. They feel that they're working hard, they're making large payments, and their loan balance is continuing to go up.
Yeah, and we do in some cases limit how much your loan balance can increase. We should do more of that because it makes no sense to just increase that loan balance for people who are never going to pay it back anyway. So that is something that we could do that would actually end up not being that expensive because so many people won't repay it. But I would note that if we keep making the income-based repayment plans more and more generous, instead of 10% of your income, you pay a smaller share, or it used to be 15%, then more and more people are going to have negative amortization because more and more people are going to have smaller payments and they're not going to cover even their interest. So we have to think as we design the program about how best to design it so it protects people, but also lets the typical borrower repay over the time period that they need to repay rather than just saying, because if we're just going to make all of the loans into grants, let's make them into grants up front instead of making people go through this process.
I would just add also, one of the things that I know has been discussed is how do we create a more dynamic process with regard to assessing people's ability to pay. So I know a lot of people were concerned about the fact that they may have been based on their incomes last year rather than their current employment status and their incomes as they fell during the pandemic. So these are we keep alluding to how do we fix the system. These are the types of things that we need to be paying attention to and hopefully integrate into the system to help people as they struggle or try to get back on their feet during this very uncertain time.
Another participant listening in has a question about the Parent Plus loans and would welcome some discussion of what you think should be done about the Parent Plus loans.
James, you're waiting quietly, so I keep thinking you're going to answer these questions. But the Parent Plus loans are, for some parents, very important because they do allow people to finance a college. But really, they were designed for, like, you don't want to sell your stock right now, so take this loan and pay it back over time. But we've been using them as a mechanism for parents who can't afford it now and are not going to be able to afford it later to borrow money so their kids can go to the college of their dreams. And you can borrow pretty much an infinite amount of money through these loans. We are not doing families a favor if we allow them to borrow so much that it's just going to ruin their lives afterwards. And those are parents whose kids need bigger Pell Grants. And so the Plus Loan program cannot solve the problem of inadequate Pell Grants. We need to make sure that we provide liquidity for parents who need liquidity, but don't just say, oh, we let you borrow the money, you're fine now, we're not worried about you.
Well, as a longtime college professor, listening to my students talk about their experiences, I know that their debt load is something that figures prominently in their thoughts and in many of the plans that they make for their futures as well. As we come to a close in the last few moments here, I'm wondering if I might invite each of you to leave us with a last word or a last insider question for the audience to consider. And if not, I can also, there's another question that's come in too from one of our colleagues. Shall we add one more question from the audience?
We can take it, Kim, I think.
Okay.
Fenaba, do you want to take a first swing, or would you like me to?
Please go ahead. Please start.
Well,
start us off, please.
I think that student loans has been a really easy answer for us for a really long time. And we run the programs at cost to the federal government. Obviously no cost to states or colleges. And it is true that, when the system works as it should, students graduate, they go on to find a well-paying job, and repaying student loan is not necessarily a huge stretch for their budgets. But I think what we're seeing more and more is the number of students for whom that system is working is quite large. We have 1 million students a year who default on their student loans. We see, evidence that student debt has gotten to a level now where it's impacting career choices and home ownership. And so it seems like we're talking a lot more about student debt. That's why it seems like we've gotten to some kind of tipping point here in the wake of the Great Recession. And it has started a real conversation about who pays for college, how much it is fair to ask students to pay, how much is fair to ask them to borrow, and what do we do about the tremendous variability in outcomes for students who don't graduate, who get a low-quality education, who are just attending to get some kind of higher education that isn't primarily economic. So there's a lot of discussion to be had here, and I think we're at the start of a really different way of thinking about college finance.
Fenaba, you have our last 20 seconds.
Oh, no. Well, I 100% agree with James's comments. I think I will say that kind of alluding to what he said earlier, that there are particular borrowers that are experiencing a lot of risk and a lot of uncertainty at this point, and it's embedded into our systems, and we need to focus on systemic change in order to really think about how we can best protect all borrowers. And I think the focus, a lot of discussion was on the repayment period, but also we need to focus on the accumulation of that debt as well. And I think in these circles, a lot of the time we tend to focus on the repayment, but we also need to be thinking, about the higher ed system and the debt financing that happens as well. So I'll just stop there.
And I just want to say that I agree with all of these things, but I also want us to think about student debt in the context of all of the problems that people are facing, including the problem of getting to college in the first place. So let's try to rescue student loan borrowers and rescue everyone else who needs the rescue.
So on behalf of the Urban Institute, we extend our profound thanks and appreciation to the panelists today, to Sandy, to James, to Fenaba, and also to the people who have joined in and who have participated in the conversation by adding their questions into the chat. Thank you all very much, and we encourage you to join us next week.
Thank you. There we go.